Hello and welcome to week 5 material for our course on moral issues in capitalism. This week we're talking about discrimination and inequality. So these are some huge topics that could fill up a lot of time, like so many of the things that we cover, and we get to brush over the surface with it. But hopefully we get you thinking a little bit. If you're writing your paper on a topic related to this, hopefully this is very helpful discussion. For week 5, we don't have writing assignments or a discussion board. We had those for the first 4 weeks, but now we're focusing on our final papers. So it's going to be short videos talking about discrimination and inequality, leaving you plenty of time to work on those final papers that are on a topic of your choosing. So discrimination is, we could all agree it's a bad thing, right? Discrimination is when decisions are made that are based on stereotypes plus some element of animus, some element of dislike or preference for one group over another. And so, for example, in the United States, we have laws for employment and housing and education that say you can't discriminate on someone, you can't prefer one person over another because of race or gender, or sex, or religion, or ethnicity, or national origin. We call those protected classes. Those are distinctions that we don't want to be the basis for denying someone a job, or to rent an apartment, or buy a house, or to have a spot in a college. Now, a good topic for discrimination to kind of put it right on point for an issue with moral issues in capitalism is affirmative action at a university. So a lot of universities have affirmative action policies, which means that they give some sort of extra preference for people from historically underrepresented minority groups. That could be people from rural areas in Appalachia. That could be African American. So it gets contentious very quickly when we use race as an affirmative action category. The Supreme Court in the US has taken this up. If this were a legal class, we'd certainly talk about some of those cases. The basic state of Supreme Court jurisprudence on affirmative action is that universities can't make a decision based explicitly on race. So you can't explicitly favor one applicant over another because one is, say, African American versus someone else who's white or Asian maybe. With that said, the Supreme Court has allowed to stand some policies that give some weight to the underrepresented status of someone, whether that's racial or other forms, as part of a multi-factor decision when looking at who to admit. And so it's a fuzzy area legally. Morally, it's a tricky area too, right? So morally, we want to treat similarly situated people in similar ways. That's kind of the whole idea of justice, equal justice. It's tricky with something like affirmative action because the question is say an African American and a white applicant to the same university, maybe they want to go to Harvard or somewhere. They both apply. If they have the same test scores, they have the same sort of grade point average with similar academic rigor in their high school transcripts, then perhaps we want to treat them equally when it comes to admission decision because they are similarly situated applicants with similar sort of numbers, a similar looking application. Their personal essays look the same, all of that. On the other side of the argument, you might say that these aren't actually similarly situated people. And so this is why affirmative action is contentious. You might say that the African American applicant may have the same numbers as the white applicant. They may have a very similar personal statement, but they're coming from a different place, from a different lived experience. They have been experiencing institutional, structural discrimination against them their whole lives. And so that's why this is contentious. People don't agree on the extent to whether that premise is true. And so for our purposes in our class, we don't have to say definitively that it is or is not true. I am going to ask you to seriously take up the idea that there's personal racism, individual racism, where individuals believe that some people are superior and other people are inferior because of something like their race. That would be individual racism. I think we would all agree that that is unfortunate. That's odious. That's not something most of us are okay with. We have statements at Western Kentucky saying we do not accept or endorse or support any sort of position like that, right? The trickier side of racism is the structural side. So even if individuals are not individually motivated to prefer one group over another, there may be historical legacies, ways that our laws, ways that our institutions are built up that end up preferring one group over another. In the law, we call that a disparate impact. And so, for example, with housing, legally for a long time, the mortgage companies were able to basically use their discretion whether to approve loans partially based on whether it was a African American applicant or a white applicant, and whether it was in a neighborhood that was predominantly African American or white. And so a practice called redlining meant that de facto most mortgage companies were much more likely to approve a loan for a white person in a white neighborhood and a black person in a black neighborhood than when we had a black person applying for a mortgage on a house that was in a predominantly white neighborhood. So those applications would get redlined, they would not get funded, and it was legal for a long time. Our laws I mentioned about housing and not being able to use these protected classes as the basis for a decision, that made the practice of redlining illegal. It continued, and in some ways it still continues today. It's not explicitly done, but it's done implicitly, and even if it's not done anymore, even if you don't agree with that empirical premise, then the legacy of it certainly continues. When you look at the segregation that exists in our cities today, whether you're looking at Louisville or Nashville or Chicago, northern cities, southern cities, we've got segregated neighborhoods in a lot of cities in this country, right? And part of that is the legacy of redlining, and it's had consequences for the wealth that's been passed down from generation to generation. So this is a structural and institutional sort of phenomenon that has affected the lives and livelihoods of a lot of current people. So things that happened in the past affect people's lived experience now. And so affirmative action, one of the rationales behind it is this is a way to compensate for those structural disadvantages you face if you're coming from an underrepresented minority group. Basically factor in, try to figure out how extensive those are and compensate for them by giving you kind of a boost in something like an application for a university. Now it's really contentious because it's not clear to what extent those structural racist elements are affecting the lived lives of people in general, let alone of an individual applicant whose application is in front of you. That's really tough to quantify if you're going to try to compensate it. And you need to quantify it if you're going to compensate for it in an adequate way, right? So it's a very contentious issue. What universities have largely done is fallen on a rationale for affirmative action. Many of them seem to be partially motivated by that idea of affirmative action to compensate for previous wrongs, or even if not for previous wrongs, then differences in lived realities. Now, the way they justify it largely is through a diversity rationale, saying education is richer, is better, if we have diverse viewpoints coming into it. And so to have that, we need diverse faculty and staff. We also need a diverse student body. So we are going to look for a mix of students that includes different racial groups, different economic groups, different geographic representation. That'll bring a diversity of lived experiences that enriches the education experience for everyone. That's the rationale most universities use, and the Supreme Court has okayed that, depending on how exactly it is implemented by the universities. So that's kind of the status of affirmative action. You may agree with it or disagree with it. Either of those positions is fine as long as you can support that position with some premises, right? One thing that is worth talking about, since this is an economics class and we're talking about discrimination, so affirmative action could apply to universities, it could apply to jobs. Economists have spent quite a bit of time looking at the issue of discrimination in employment, and again, trying to kind of quantify it. How much more likely are you to receive a job offer if you are a white applicant versus a similarly qualified black applicant? Now, it could go either way, right? You could have applicants with the same application profile, and maybe the white one will get preference, maybe the black one will get preference, through an affirmative action sort of rationale. But often we think of it as the white applicant getting preference over the black applicant. And of course, this can be expanded to look at Asians and Hispanic and all different sorts of groups. You could look at religions, and you have Protestants versus Catholics versus Jews versus Muslims. All of these are issues that people spend time studying, because people do have stories where they have lived experiences where they've been discriminated against based on features to the best of their knowledge, but trying to find out what goes on in the decision makers' heads is notoriously difficult. And so economists turn to empirical evidence, looking at labor data and trying to find ways to measure the amount of discrimination we see based on something like race. And it's difficult because you're in many ways looking at all of the different factors that go into whether someone gets hired or how much they're paid if they are hired. You're looking at differences between, say, white employees and black employees, and explaining them with differences in education, differences in work experience, differences in other measures that we might have. If some jobs there's some sort of productivity measure, piece rate, how quickly can you do certain tasks that you do in your job. We try to use all those things to explain the differences in, say, wages for employees, black versus white, and what we're left with might be evidence of discrimination. If there's an unexplained difference between those two, that might be driven by discrimination. But the might is the tricky part. It's a process of elimination thing, and there's always something else that could be contributing to this difference. And so, since the people who are making these decisions about who to hire or how much to pay them never explicitly say, I'm paying this person less because of their skin color, they they could even do that and not believe it's happening, something called implicit bias. But whether it's implicit or explicit, they're never going to answer a survey truthfully, or very few of them, saying, I'm paying these employees less because of their skin color. For one, they would be putting themselves at liability because they would be breaking employment laws. But also it goes against what most of us, when we said most of us agree that this individual motivated racism is not a good thing, it's not okay. And so people don't want to say, I am that person who prefers one group over another. So we have to look for it in kind of what's left over after we try to explain it with all the other measures that we have. And that process of elimination is a never-ending game because there's always something else that could be contributing, and that's one reason why it's a very contentious area of empirical study within labor economics, is looking at measuring the amount of difference. This is also true if we're looking at discrimination based on sex, males versus female employees. A lot of times you hear statistics about a female earning 30% less than a male for the same job, same work. Sometimes it's 17 cents less for every dollar. There are different studies that try to account for different things, measure it in slightly different ways. Almost all of them end up with some unexplained gap that again could be driven by discrimination. Economists often leave discrimination as kind of the last possible explanation, because economic theory largely says, a simple economic theory would say that a firm that discriminates based on taste-based racism, the individuals in the firm prefer one group over another, that means they're passing up on well-qualified people of other races, and other firms in the market that don't have that racist element are going to be able to snatch up those workers at kind of a bargain and do better, outcompete them in the market. And so basic economic theory would say firms that are motivated by racist or other discriminatory tendencies are going to end up being outcompeted in the market by firms that don't have those same sort of discriminatory preferences, because those other firms are going to be able to get all of those good workers who are being overlooked. And so if you're in the IT industry and you run a firm but you prefer not working with Indians, people from the country of India, but other firms are perfectly happy to hire coders and engineers who are Indian, well, those other firms may end up outcompeting you, right? That's what this theory says, because you're going to have to kind of pay a premium if you're only hiring, say, native-born American coders and engineers. There aren't that many. You're going to have to offer them kind of a bonus to lure them away from their current employment, where the other firms that are perfectly happy working with employees that are from other backgrounds, they'll be able to outcompete you because their labor costs are substantially lower. And so that's a theory that a lot of economists kind of have in the back of their head when they're thinking about discrimination, thinking it shouldn't exist in long-term, large-scale sort of ways because of that basic competitive pressure. Now there's a lot of pushback. Like all theories, it's built on assumptions, and the labor market is notoriously tricky to study. It's interesting but tricky because it has so many frictions. And there are so many things going on when it comes to employment. People don't love moving away from their families. People have health care that's tied to their jobs. People really spend a lot of time with their coworkers, so it's not just about compensation, it's about the experience they have at work. All of those things make it more complicated than simply saying, okay, people are going to chase the highest wages they can get. We know that's too simplistic, and in a way that's what a model like that ends up assuming. The empirical reality, again, it's hard to measure because it's kind of process of elimination. People do studies where they create fictitious applicants for jobs, and some of them are black and some are white, or some have names that people might associate as Asian or African American or different groups, and look at response rates for different things like that. And they certainly find, in general, evidence that white applicants are preferred over other groups for a lot of different job categories. But again, there's always going to be pushback to any individual study and even the whole group of studies in that literature. So it's an open issue. That's one of the ways economics is contributing to our understanding of discrimination in employment and universities and things like that. It's trying to help quantify it. How extensive is this? But it's a tricky one, and it's definitely a work in progress. So I'll leave it at that. We'll next turn to kind of income inequality, wealth inequality, both at a more local and a global scale, and that will wrap up our material for the course.